Hi, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. We are so excited to get the year started off with checking your bias and sirens outside my window. So sorry about that. That is the loveliness of lives. My name is Alexandria. I am the co-founder of the Disruptors and an executive leadership coach. I focus mostly on women and LGBTQIA people in tech who are coming into leadership positions. The Disruptors itself is a job board that is meant to support people from underrepresented communities who want to find jobs in companies they can thrive in. Our intention today is talking about bias and how to uncover it in the interview process and hopefully reduce it. I'm going to pass it over to our co-host Jasleen so she can introduce herself.
Hi, guys. So if you're new here, I'm Jasleen. I'm a career and leadership coach with a corporate background for about a decade in HR and also an educational background in psychology. And I help women in tech who are really overworked and underrepresented, underrecognized, get what they deserve in the workplace. And yeah, we're super excited to be talking about catching bias. And we have Kim Tran here, who's really passionate about this topic. And so, Kim, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you both so much. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm even more excited, and I think it's good vibes, good energy that this is the topic that we're speaking about right at the top of the new year. I think a lot of folks are looking for jobs, hiring for this year, and so this is so timely. And so a little bit about me. I am Kim Tran, Director of Marketing. I currently work for a B2B tech company, software as a service, SaaS for short. But I wasn't always in marketing. I actually graduated into the last recession, dating myself here a little bit, but started off thinking I wanted to become a lawyer. Worked in media litigation, First Amendment. So I was definitely a non-traditional candidate in terms of marketing and advertising for a while. And then since then have worked in a variety of industries now. And of course, as I grew in my career, started hiring, less of the candidate side, but still being very intentional about it. Like Jasleen, I actually majored in psychology. So I think a lot about human nature, human behaviors, both as a marketer, but also as a leader and as a marketing leader as well. And so super excited to be here to chat with both of you ladies.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. I'm super excited about this conversation. I think that people talk a lot about bias right now. Like there's tons of buzzword and all kinds of things out there. And yet it's still such a touchy subject and people wanting to distance themselves from it almost like, oh, others are biased, others have this problem versus looking inward, right? And that really holding up the mirror of like, okay, what is still showing up for me? Because we've been doing, like Jasleen and I have talked about, we've been doing this work for a very long time. And even when we go do that implicit bias test, things still show up, right? Enculturation is still a thing. Like you have your tendencies, we have media, we have all of this stuff all the time that is still informing how we think and behave. So I think having this conversation continuously is super, super important. So starting off with maybe what is bias for those of us who maybe don't have a full framing of that, how would you all define what that looks like or means?
Go ahead, Jasleen.
I think we all sort of have these core beliefs that we hold, right? And we aren't even aware of them, how tightly we hold on to these core beliefs. And they serve us well because they're anchors in terms of like human psychology. We don't deal well with uncertainty, and we want to be able to predict the future, and we want to be able to predict people. And what helps us do that is holding on to our core beliefs and all of the data that we've been collecting throughout our lives, all of the messaging, the marketing, everything that's being fed to us. It gets internalized, and we don't realize on a subconscious level how much we're kind of going through life unconsciously acting and behaving on these core beliefs. And so I love this conversation because it is about catching bias. We all have bias. And I come across a lot of people in the DEI space who are like, oh, trust me, I get it. Like I grew up with diversity. There's, diversity all around me. But they don't really understand the inclusion and equity piece. So much of that is the reason why we have inequity. The reason why we have exclusive practices is because of bias. That's at the root of it. And so really, if you're a human and you're breathing, you have bias. Okay. So like, even if you're not human, animals have bias. I see it with my dog. We all have bias, and it's not there to be like, I feel like a lot of people want to shame people and call people out. And we are here, the disruptors are here to really start calling people in. It's not about shaming and blaming. It's about recognizing we all have it. And so some of us are better at spotting it in others, but it's really about thinking about yourself and recognizing your own biases.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so sometimes
I
that's
love
the first step. You start seeing it in other people, you start calling people out, but until you've started calling yourself in, you haven't started doing the work. And so, yeah, it's really about those core beliefs.
I love that you make a distinction between calling people out and calling people in. I think one of the first things that attracted me to my current role was my leadership. My CEO, during one of our very early conversations, he said, we have a strict culture of no a-holes and no egos. And for me, like the sweet spot was no ego. And I think bias is really about like almost protection, right? We've gone through life. All of us have these very diverse experiences of life, of work and career. And those internalized beliefs have protected us to some point, but also enabled us to function in ways that, we've gotten used to. And that comfort and familiarity has helped us day to day. And so when you start calling out things that you see or calling in people, it really becomes about also like part of the bias is not only being aware of that, but being accountable to our biases as well. Because I think the most exciting trend for me in the DEI space across industries is that, and really the opportunity for change and growth is that people are aware, but now people are also making sure that they themselves and others are also being held accountable to actually, put their awareness into action. And I think that's not just an individual thing, but really collectively as well. So I think sharing that, that hurrah or mantra behind bias and how you want to address bias is really exciting for me moving forward.
Yeah, I love that you brought up ego, because there's a lot of ego in the workplace. And I've reframed ego as not necessarily being a negative thing. The ego is there to protect us.
Yeah.
And so the bigger the ego, the more you are hiding your vulnerability, and you are keeping your cards really close to you, and you are, being secretive about things, or you are projecting things onto other people. And so in the workplace, we've been conditioned to have this because a lot of us have been hurt and burned before in the workplace. And so we've been taught that we don't bring our whole selves to work, right? And so I think the key message around ego is that even ego is not a bad thing. Some of us have developed it as a coping mechanism. So again, it's not to say, oh yeah, that's my ego, and try to like, the ego will always be there. I don't care if you are, a monk meditating every day. You still have an ego. It's going to show up. The only difference is you are going to be able to, it's a muscle you practice to observe when it's coming into the conversation. It's always here with us. It's always part of who we are. But there are pieces of vulnerability in our whole self that we leave behind when we enter the workspace. And that's just not good for anyone, because if we're not being authentic, if we're constantly sacrificing who we are, then we aren't going to be fulfilled in our work. And we're always going to have this sort of dichotomy of, our work self and our authentic self.
Yeah.
And so it's about that path to authenticity. And so especially in the tech space, because if you want to disrupt in tech, you have to understand people first. And you can't do that until you start bringing down your own barriers and coming from a place of really being empathetic and gathering data. And so that's kind of where I feel like for a lot of people who might not even be aware of how their ego's coming into play is just to start that data gathering. Like really think about that. So when we're talking about catching bias, how are you like really gathering data to understand your people and your customers?
I think that gathering data piece is super important, right? It's that curiosity. It's the but why, right? My default setting, but why? Why do I think this? Why do I feel like this? And really honing in on that. When you have a thought about a person, a group, a department, or whatever, oh, they're this, oh, they're that. Why do you think that? Is it subjective information that you're basing it off of, or is it objective information that you're basing it off of? Is it measurable? Is it visible? Is it recordable? And if it's not, then you need to dig in deeper. What is this thought or this feeling or judgment? Where is it coming from? And super important in the interview process, right? You've already made tons of judgments about this human before you even set that interview with them. You went through their resume. Does your company do things to autonomize resumes, or did you make some judgment based on education, where they went to school, whether they went to school, where they've worked in the past, what their name is? All of those things affect the judgments that you were bringing into that initial conversation with that person, especially if you haven't taken a moment to check in with yourself. The biggest thing that they found with bias is becoming aware that you have it helps reduce it, because now you're asking questions. And so I want to dive in first with some of the 3 major, very visible biases, and then we're going to jump into some of the invisible ones. But the 3 that show up very specifically in tech as big problems right now is we have gender bias, right now, always. We have gender bias, we have racial bias, and we have age bias, are huge, huge ones that are super visible and show up all the time. So when we think about gender bias showing up in the interview process, what would you encourage people to look for in themselves to notice if it's showing up for them?
Yeah, for me, it's, there's the visible bias for sure. And as an underrepresented population, I'm a woman, I'm a minority woman. For me, I feel like because I've experienced it, I'm much more heightened to other, potential biases to others like me, quote unquote. But for others who aren't like me, who may be hiring, I think it's also about sharing my experiences, me feeling safe to share that experience with my team, with other folks, who will be part of the interviewing process, and being very clear about what we are looking for past the visible stuff, so that people can focus on, things that we're looking for. So not so much about, industry experience or the school they went to or things like that, but really focusing on skills, focusing on what are we prioritizing for this candidate, so that we talk less about, the visible stuff, the school, the background, and really hone in on, the abilities, the traits, the competencies, things like that. And so it's a little bit of a reframe for me off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alexandria, I have so many gender biases that I could share. So I do a lot of research around this, but I want to really call our attention to one in particular where it's the prove it again bias. And so this has been studied and documented. And really what this is around is when women are assessed on performance. And so they have to perform again and again and again to get promoted or hired. And so they need to have that solid record of this is what I did, right? Where men are assessed on potential. And so potential and performance are two very different things. Like potential is really about looking at you as a whole person, like not the sum of your parts, not each of those things that you did, but you as a whole person. It's looking at your general behaviors, your demeanor, and all, and even that can really come back to bite us as women, because there is a double bind in terms of those behaviors. So we can be told we're not confident enough, and then when we work on confidence, we're told we're too confident or too aggressive. And so the acceptable behaviors for women fall into a narrower band. So we have to follow this narrow band of acceptable behaviors to prove our potential. But even when we're doing that, people are going back to make sure that, so you might think that you're inclusive and you're bringing women into the hiring process. Maybe some of them are even making it to the final round of interviews, but pay attention as you're taking notes to how you are assessing, and even like do a T table on your notes and have, okay, where am I assessing performance? Where am I assessing potential? And have that discussion before the interview process to say, what do we mean by performance and what do we mean by potential? Because I think
I love that.
where people are really getting tripped up is now they're realizing that, you know, we want to assess culture fit because we know we're going to have a more cohesive and inclusive organization if we have culture fit. But then that can also create a homogeneous type of environment, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's really about understanding your business and what are the behaviors that you need to get the business to where it needs to go. And then do the work once you have that diverse employee group to make sure that all the differences are being valued, because those are going to enrich your company. It's going to enrich the ways you work. It's going to challenge people outside of their own mindsets to be more creative and to find new solutions. And so again, it's like remembering what your why is around this when it comes to gender, catching the gender bias. Like really remember why you want women in your organization, right? Even as women hiring other women, we have to think about what it's like, because we've internalized our own misogyny. We do it to each other,
I think
right?
there's a lot of feedback. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. I'm not sure for which of us the feedback is coming
Yeah,
through.
I'm not sure. It might be me because I have a new mic going on. Is that better?
I can still hear it, but I think it is you because when
Okay, I'm gonna unplug this.
okay.
Yeah, and while you do that, Jasleen, I think you know, I love that you bring that up, because I think process and systems are so important, and making sure that, you know, we were talking about gathering data, making sure that that data is both quantitative and qualitative, because that way you can really assess and balance out what you are tracking, but also making sure that, yes, the numbers are the numbers, but how are they being interpreted? You know, based on the candidate, whether they're women or, you know, gender wise, age wise, demographic wise. One thing that I would say has been a process or a system that has worked well for many companies, but that continues to perpetuate bias indirectly, is recruiting from specific schools. I've been at much bigger organizations, much bigger companies, you know, the top 4 consulting firms, they have go-to schools that they recruit from. My alma mater, you know, we just had someone from my university who got hired at a specific consulting firm that's been around for 100 years. Like, why? It's been 100 years and this is the first person you've hired from this school. That great. But like looking back at that process, you know, and really taking ego out of it and saying, you know, why didn't we recruit from the school specifically? And do we even need to recruit someone with a 4-year degree, right? Like there's an organization who's doing really great work that I was had the chance to interview with in the past, is opportunity at work. They have this program called Skilled Through Alternative Means, so the STARS. And these are folks who, have the skills that they need, but they may not have attained those skills through a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree, traditionally, but they can do the job and they're able to do the job. And so really looking at process systems, yes, just like our biases, they've protected us, they've enabled to do certain things in the past, but moving forward, where can we improve that process? What can we really challenge about that process in a healthy way so that we can improve that moving forward?
I love that you brought up, so you and I were chatting a little bit before this, and we both have had non-traditional career paths. And so when I started my corporate career at a very competitive oil and gas company, they were only recruiting from very specific business schools. I don't even have a business degree. And so when I think about my own journey of how hard it was to first get in and prove myself again, and then also even once I was in the organization, having that different skill set, people didn't understand because I had that industrial organizational psychology background, like where I could add value from that point of view. And so it's always sort of an uphill battle when you're coming into an organization that doesn't understand. And so that's another question to kind of say, if we were to go to this different school, if we were to go to this different type of degree or bring in different skill sets deliberately for people who are saying they want to do this work, what value might that add? Like how, if we had, if you're looking at program managers or product managers and you're thinking about, okay, whether the person has a tech background or not, what might be the benefit of someone who doesn't have the tech background, right?
Yep.
Obviously, we still want to reward people for their technical skills, and we need those technical skills. But when you're in an organization that is trying to predict the trends and what is going to be the next disruptor, then having these people who are more agile and thinking of outside of the box, and the people who've had to hustle, right? There's something to be said for the people who did have those uphill battles. It was harder for them to get in school. It was harder for them to get in the door at that organization. And because they didn't have privilege or connections that was was handed to them, and it gives you a different mindset that, I worry about my kids now because I'm raising them as very privileged. And so it's like, how do you create grit for people? And so that grit is I think an undervalued trait when we're looking at candidates, because that resilience is really going to help, it's going to help in so many ways.
Yeah.
For sure. I think the other thing that comes up there is slowing down long enough to say, what are we really looking for, right? Like we've said a couple of different times, like, how would I know if this person can do the job? Because that's the whole point of an interview, right? That's the whole intention, is how do I know that the person sitting in front of me can fulfill the responsibilities of this role? And the school they went to doesn't guarantee that. The previous experience doesn't necessarily guarantee that, right? So it becomes, how do I formulate questions to determine skills, to determine if they have the ability, if they have the thinking ability, because also skills can be taught. And anybody who's coming into your organization is going to have to learn your organization. It doesn't matter if they've done project management for the last 20 years at 5 different companies, they're going to have to learn project management at your company specifically. So letting go of some of those easy boxes of school or of education or of companies that they've worked for, and really honing in on, okay, how do they think about the job? How do they think about problem solving? And can they articulate that? Because being able to do that, right, as a job seeker, we have to be able to say, hey, these are the skills and the value I'm bringing to you and how I think you can solve your problem. But it's also just as much on the employer to say, oh, I can hear that they think about problems in a way that would be beneficial to me, or I wouldn't have thought about it that way. That's an interesting way to think about it, and let that ego go, right? You don't necessarily know everything. And that's the culture add versus culture fit, and how they can be valuable because they have a different experience. And even thinking about industries, right? There's a lot of people who try and move into tech, and they hit this roadblock of startups being like, oh, you don't have startup experience, or oh, you don't have tech experience. You have to be agile and flexible and fast paced and all of these things. Like, okay, well, do you know what other industries require people to be super fast paced and thinking on their feet and always changing? What about teaching? What about construction? What about aerospace? Those all have very transferable skills, but there's this block of, oh, well, you don't have tech experience. But that doesn't answer your question. So what is the question you're actually asking? And how do you get that answer?
Yeah, I love that. I think obviously industry experience is important, but just as COVID, kind of threw us all in the loop, like regardless of industry, every organization, every company had to rethink work, interviews, their employee base in very similar ways. And that was agnostic of whether you were in pharma or tech or teaching, all of that. And so I think remembering again what the unifying transferable skills as a candidate and speaking to that throughout the interview is super important, obviously. But on the hiring side, making sure that, again, you're pivoting away from, oh, well, this person doesn't have an industry experience, and really focusing on, well, what are their abilities? What are their traits? And that takes some internal awareness of what your needs are when you are recruiting for a specific role. Rather than saying, we need someone with 5 years of experience. Really, do you really need someone with 5 years of experience, or do you need someone who has achieved, XYZ, regardless of how long or wherever they came from previously? But of course, that's very human. It's in our nature, right, to go with tried and true experience, big brands, things like that. I had a moment early on in my career where, my own bias was, oh, a bigger company or a bigger brand, because they're exciting as a brand, will probably be a better fit for me. But that was my own bias, where I found that my sweet spot isn't so much, a recognizable name or a recognizable industry. I've been in financial services now, internet domain industry, infrastructure. But what the sweet spot for me is, again, focusing on traits or abilities or things that really light me up, regardless of, all of these like biases that are visible, whether it's on the organizational side or the candidate side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? We patternize because it's easy. And so taking just a breath to step back and say, okay, what do we really need here? And what are we really looking for? And how do we quantify that and communicate that in a way that's helpful? The other ones that we talked about, right? We talked a lot about gender bias. Racial bias still hugely shows up in the tech space. Tech is still 83% white. And I don't have the numbers on men, but I know that tech executives are 83% white men. And so we're still running into these things. And some of that starts with representation and recruiting from a very young age to put people on paths of even being interested or knowing that tech is an option for them to be in, as well as all the options within tech, because it's not just coding. And I think that that's another very common misconception that, oh, to be in tech, I have to be this coding guru who just like sits behind and do all these things. Like, that's what's been branded out there, but there's tons of options for positions and skills that are needed in the tech space. But racial bias still hugely shows up. Again, it shows up all the way with the resume, whether you have a name, right? People with traditionally considered Black or people of color names are 50% less likely to get a phone call than people who have white presenting names. Like, we can remove that from the process. But then when you sit in front of the interviewer, you still have that racial bias that could be potentially showing up. Jasleen, I think you've talked about a study that came out of Harvard that even with the same exact background and skills, that women of color specifically were judged more harshly as not skilled enough for the same position as white male counterparts.
And they could have the same elite internship, and the white male candidate would be given more points for that exact same. And so again, it was really clear in that study, they looked at a few different factors that, and these were all recruiters that identified as really caring about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think that's the important piece when it comes to racial bias. I feel like a lot of people just kind of say, well, I'm not racist. So we've all got internalized racism. So again, we have the internalized bias. Even if we're a person of color, we have internalized racism. And so it's unpacking that and just putting mechanisms in place to ensure that it's not there. And really just making that connection, like you said, Kim, to the actual requirements for the job. And which of those requirements were just a copy paste from an old job description that you've been using for 10 years. And you said, well, it's been working, so we don't want to go. And because we want to be efficient too, because we talked about, bias helps us in the way of predictability, because it helps us move through the world without as much uncertainty, because that's uncomfortable. But it's also there to help us with efficiency. And so if we've built efficiency into the process, that's great. We want to keep that efficiency. But every couple years, you need to do a check at, like, what are these efficiencies? What are the built-in biases? So whether it's in your applicant tracking system, like you might be filtering out based on bias even before you get to the interviews, even before you see the resumes and screen the candidates. So where is that built-in bias that was done for a good reason, because you wanted to be efficient and predict outcomes? But we know that the outcome that we're predicting is more of the same type of candidate getting rewarded in the system.
Yeah.
And I think checking the data, right? That's because, like, you gather the data, but you have to go back and check it. And, like, is the thing that we put in place for efficiency getting us the results that we wanted, or are we repeating the same patterns? So did it change the performance evaluations? Is there huge disparities between how people are being rated in their performance? And that can be applied specifically in the interviews. Like, how are you scoring the candidates? What are you scoring them on? And what effect did that have once they got into the position? So it's not just like a one and done checking the box exercise. It's you create it and then you improve on it. And so coming back to it and going into the data, did it get us what we wanted? And if it didn't, how do we adjust it?
Yeah. One thing when you said disparity, the immediate thought that came into my head that affects a lot of women, and especially women and people of color, is pay disparity, and pay equity. And, for me, it's the pay transparency laws are hugely exciting for me. Obviously, there's room for improvement there. I know some companies will put out a crazy range that is not realistic. But there are some companies, again, that who are really, not just required by law, but who are really adhering to the process and trying to improve that and all of that. And I think that pay transparency is, as a whole, really something that is helping overcome bias. But the other piece to that is what happens after the pay transparency when someone is interviewing and they want to negotiate at the higher level or higher top range rather than a bottom level. And that's something that people should be thinking about. But also, I want to share, like, a Harvard, I think that was a Harvard study recently where, people are saying, oh, well, women don't negotiate and women of color don't negotiate. And that's not true. Women negotiate just as much, if not more, than men. But research has shown that when they do negotiate, we encounter more biases, more negative reactions, and more negative perceptions of our behaviors when we do negotiate. And so being aware that, yes, obviously advocate for yourself, negotiate, don't let those biases stop you from speaking up, but making sure that hiring managers and training your hiring managers, whoever is part of the interview, is really aware of those biases and beliefs as well when they do interact or encounter the candidates and final candidates throughout the interview process.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, sorry. There was a study, I was just going to mention a study that was done on women versus men giving ultimatums in the negotiation process where they say, okay, I want this or I'm going to walk. And it would work for men and it would backfire on women. And that's another reason why in this career coaching and leadership coaching space, I really like to bring in the bias lens, because even when you're choosing a coach and you think about, okay, you're going to go to a man who this has worked for him before, and this has worked for his male clients before, but you really have to be careful about the career advice that you take and the lens in which it was given in. And so I love that you're bringing that up. There are things, if we can follow the playbook exactly, and it won't work for us. And so it's really important to be mindful of that as a candidate, but then also as the employer doing the hiring, don't fall into those traps. Because think about, like, what are those feelings that are coming up for you when a woman says that to you, where she says, this is what I'm worth or I'm going to walk, versus when a man, like, really just like put yourself in that experience and think about, like, what are the feelings that come up if it's a woman? Where is that coming from? Right? It's internalized misogyny. And like, I don't really like using the word misogyny because we know that it's not an overt hate for women, but it's a conditioning that women can only, and then especially if you're a woman of color, and like if you're Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, that is just going to be amplified even more, because there's an expectation, there's a bias that exists that you should be grateful to be here.
Yeah. Ooh, that hits me, because I mentioned this. I graduated into the last financial recession with a psychology degree, no connections, worked throughout my my time in undergrad. So didn't have like Uncle Bill with a job at his firm to offer to me. My parents were, working immigrants. And I remember, that standing up for myself and advocating, negotiating for more money, and having my own internalized bias that I had to be aggressive and I had to like take on a certain persona to negotiate that was just not me, but what I had seen in the media, what I had internalized from my, from my culture, from everything else on TV, whatever. And realizing that like my own internalized bias were wrong, and you can be grateful and demand more, like those are not mutually, like those are mutually exclusive. Like you can say, I am grateful for this job and this is where I would like to see improvement or opportunity for change or whatever it is. And I think that's a bias or internalized belief that I personally have, but I also see a lot of women and a lot of people of color specifically. Like I come from a refugee and immigrant family where it was internalized that you should just accept the status quo. Don't ask questions, keep your head down, all of that. And so being aware of it in myself has also helped others being aware of this and these conversations, right? Like every time you all mention a word or a concept, like it triggers other things within me. And I'm just like really excited about this.
I love that you say that, Kim, because I have so many clients who are in that space who are like, this is just not me. Negotiating in this way is just not me. But we've internalized our identity based on the conditioning we've gotten in our culture. And so as first generations, if we, the immigrant mentality is put your head down, don't ask questions, like you said, like just status quo, stay in your lane, don't disrupt. That is the immigrant mentality that has been passed on to a lot of us first generation, in the US and Canada. So, and to the point of like, you can be grateful and demand more. I love that, because when we think it's one or the other and we have to fit into a box, we're actually in our limbic system. We're in our emotional brain, which sees the world as black or white. And I know Alexandria and I have talked a lot about, let's stop saying but, let's say and, like when we're talking about building this business and really like expanding into possibility. It's not this or that, it's maybe this and that. We are more than one thing. We're not a monolith. We are multidimensional people. And I think that's a really important message to take home if you're really trying to do this work and catch your own bias. Is it's not like we get into that mindset again that, okay, now I have to learn every culture and every gender and put people in a box based on their diversity, their whatever labels we're putting on them. But it's less about that and more about creating the behaviors and the mindset within your organization at all levels that is going to catch bias, not only when it comes to how you're treating people, but how you're operating.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you bring up the word but versus and, because that's such a creative like ideation tactic too. When we do brainstorming and marketing, there are no bad ideas. There are ideas to be improved on. So like, you know, when someone reacts to an idea or something like that, you don't say but, or you don't like go into what can't work or can work. You say, okay, yes, and. And I think that brings up this concept of language matters so much when it comes to bias and being inclusive. And I caught my own bias recently when I was going through a diversity inclusion training, where the word stand up is a technical industry tech word. But for someone who may be handicapped, who has physical disabilities and cannot literally stand up, that might not be inclusive to them. I never even thought about it that way, just because I've accepted that stand-ups are stand-ups, right? And so I think having these conversations are so key, because we do catch ourselves using these types of words or, you know, industry accepted trends or words or language that, you know, becomes the norm, right? But unless we are talking about it and not talking about it, we can't change it.
Yeah, those are all great examples. Master slave is another one, which I'm so grateful that we have finally started to get rid of that in the tech space. Yeah, so like if you have a master node that has the slaves out that go talk to it, and it's shifted over to parent child, which is better. I'm not sure that that's going to be the end of it or should be the end of it, but just being aware of those things, right? It was so accepted for so long that you're like, oh, that's just what it is. Like, okay, but let's unpack what that actually is communicating. And actually, I think that is a good segue, because we're nearing the end and talking about, right, you want to catch your bias. The first place that you start is checking in with your thoughts and your feelings, especially if they're feeling based, because there's so much bias that shows up that it's not visible, right? We show up and have judgments on things that we are perceiving, but we don't know how to call out that we're perceiving it, right? And so if somebody comes in who is neurodivergent or specifically has autism, or a person who is dyslexic or a major anxiety disorder, how they show up in an interview is going to be atypical of somebody else. And so when that shows up in your interview, catching your thoughts and feelings and saying, okay, what is objectively happening and what meaning am I making of it? And is this an opportunity to get more curious and ask some questions? Or am I writing it off of, oh, well, they stumbled over everything, like they're not confident, they can't do this job, they don't know what they're talking about? Or do they have trouble verbally communicating? Do they trip over their words?
Yeah. I love that you touched on feelings, because I think that's been a common theme that we've been talking about here, because when we're in that either or mindset, that's feelings based. That's the limbic system. And so, not that there's anything wrong with feelings. Feelings belong in the workplace too, as long as we're processing them and interpreting why they're there. And so sometimes it's there because of bias, right? It's because we believe that this is the typical ideal worker. We've got this mindset, this belief in our mind. And so it's really about getting out of our limbic system. And, when words do matter. And that's why when I'm coaching someone, I'm really using the right words and mirroring back the right words to get us into our neocortex, which is the future focused, solution focused part of our brain. And so we really want to be in that type of mindset when we're assessing for performance and potential. We want to think about, okay, what are the solutions we need to get to? What does this look like for the future of the company? And not, because that's where we get into that feelings based of, oh, I just don't have a good feeling about this candidate. It's triggering you, right? And so what are your triggers? You need to be aware of them, and what are your biases around what that ideal worker looks like. And I think, even going through an exercise with your hiring team, with your leadership on reimagining the ideal worker and really thinking outside of the box of and even just doing like an assessment of the skills that you have in the organization and then the skills you don't have, because a lot of the people who think differently and act differently, that's where those skills are for the future. Because you got to look at the skill and the talent pool as a whole and look at your gaps and not just fall into this kind of surface level, okay, I've got this job and I'm hiring for this person. Look at your organization as a living, breathing organism that is moving through this changing world. And what are those deliberate things that you're bringing in for the future?
Mm-hmm. And I know, Kim, you have lots of thoughts on this because this was a piece of the topic you wanted to make sure we touched on.
Yeah. I think, obviously coming from a psychology background like you, Jasleen, I'm always thinking about the invisible biases and making sure that, in order to be inclusive, you need diverse inputs as well. And having that hiring committee of diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds, diverse thoughts is so key throughout the process, not just from a hiring perspective, but really, I love the internal gap exercise, because an organization will always have gaps, whether it's a skill-based and or a personality thing. And I want to bring up a invisible, bias that is kind of on the lighter side, introversion versus extroversion. And I think the accepted belief sometimes in tech, especially for my function or department, marketing, it's mostly extroverts. And so someone who is probably more introverted will probably show up differently in an interview. And, you brought up this comment around do I like this person? Do I not like this person? And it's, making sure that you have that hiring committee at the end of the deliberation process and having someone who say, do you like the person or were they just more introverted? And really making sure that, having that person or personality or hiring input that is different from the hiring manager or the candidate or whoever it is, and making sure that those folks, really speak up and fostering the psychological safety for folks to speak up as well. I am the first to say that I'm an introvert. People never believe me, but I am an introvert. I am mostly probably never the loudest person in the room. And so making sure that, even when throughout the interview process that, someone who can hold me accountable to saying, hey, Kim, I haven't heard you speak up. Making sure that you provide your input is so helpful to me. Because yes, I have all these thoughts, and you just did it, Alexandria, where you were like, I know, Kim, you had a lot of thoughts around this. I never want to interrupt someone. That's not in my nature. But having someone making sure that I am included in the conversation, whether it's, a candidate or hiring managers, is really something, a tangible example and action that someone can take throughout their interview process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being able to recognize how people are showing up, right? The affinity bias is what shows up there, right? We're looking for people like us because we feel comfortable and at ease with people that we perceive as like us. And what we perceive as like us could be very different across the spectrum based on your background and your upbringing and all of those things, right? So some people are really good at, the personality wise, they're like me, and race and gender playing less of a role in that affinity bias. And it's still affinity bias,
Yeah.
right? We're tending towards someone like us. So I, like you, am on the introverted side. I can play an extrovert on TV for a very short amount of time and then I need to go rest, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But how that shows up is sometimes people who are very extroverted, I perceive as a lot, and I need to like step back from them. And so it's not the perception I have of you, but I have had that of other people who I perceive as extroverted.
I relate to that so much.
Yeah.
But catching that, right? So if I'm interviewing somebody for my department and they are just like on fire and all over the place and all of this, and I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
And that shows up for me, then I need to say, is this a problem, or is this skills based, or is this feelings, and is this me? And like, okay, let's say they have all the skills I need. Now it becomes, okay, how do I stretch as a leader to be inclusive of this person that could bring value to my team? They may be able to bring the energy up in meetings, which allows for more brainstorming. That would be great, right? And so being aware of those things, affinity bias can be beneficial, but catch it, right?
Yeah.
Always catch the bias, right?
Because we're looking at strengths as well through the lens of our own, right? And so what's helped me as an extrovert, I actually really love working with introverts because I find that it balances me a little bit, right? Because I can be too much like out there and I have to get into kind of work mode and quiet mode. And so for me, it's like after I've had a meeting, I reflect and I think, did I really listen to everyone's viewpoints? Do I have everyone's viewpoints clear enough in my mind that I know exactly where they stand on this issue? Not that you have to do like accommodate everyone, but really taking in all the viewpoints to then come up with the best solution for the business. And also understanding why the different viewpoints of someone who's not like you are valuable. Introverts can be very good listeners. They're listening on a deeper level than you are, right? And so obviously I'm a coach, so I've had to practice at this as an extrovert, and I have tools in place to make sure I do that. But like, it's really sometimes in your organization when you're an extrovert and you're going from meeting to meeting, there's so much value in sitting down with someone who has been looking at things at a deeper level. Problem solving skills are stronger. There's so many values there that you got to think about, what are my gaps and who complements those gaps? What are the organization's gaps and who complements those gaps? And we've talked about this before. There's a myth out there that focusing on diversity is lowering the bar on talent, which is absolutely wrong. And, if we were just hiring for diversity, we just learned when we had someone on, we had an employment lawyer on, and we learned that that's actually illegal. I thought you were allowed to set hard targets, but apparently it's illegal anyways, right? So we're not saying go and hire diversity just for the sake of diversity.
Right.
We're saying it makes sense. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's actually critical in today's market.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So as we're closing, I want to invite anybody who is watching to put any comments or questions that you may have in the chat, and we can respond to those. Dr. Carrie-Ann, very nice to see you. Thank you for commenting very early on. I meant to catch it and I didn't. But then if you had to just give one piece of advice to hiring managers or job seekers about checking bias and starting to become more aware of it, what would that be?
Ooh, let me think on this a little bit.
I'll let you think. For me, I think it's really what I said at the beginning of this episode is really thinking about what your core beliefs are. Like really journal, have an introspective exercise on what are my core beliefs around people. What are my core beliefs around talent? What are my core beliefs around what we need in this business to thrive and what the process needs to look like? And then when you look at those beliefs, then think about, how can I start to be more flexible around these? Because that flexibility is going to make your whole organization more agile. And so moving from those core beliefs and just kind of thinking about why you have them, where they come from, and then what are some quick wins, low hanging fruit where you can start to gather more data and look at how you're doing things, and even bring people into the process of how you might start looking at hiring, not just hiring and interviews, but everything more inclusively.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think for me, what comes up is, similar themes to Jasleen: progress, not perfection. Making sure that whatever change you want for the organization or even you as a candidate when you interview, one bad interview does not mean, bad interviews for life, right? And making sure that you learn from it. And also on the other side, feedback. I am a huge feedback person. That's how I've learned. That's how I improve individually. And so for an organization, reaching back out to your candidates, whether they get hired or not, and making sure that, hey, you get their feedback on how things went. But also as a job searcher, job seeker, reaching back out to the employer, potential employer organization, and saying, hey, do you have feedback for me? And or here's some of my reactions or feedback, and then tweaking it from there. But I think mostly from a very tactical perspective, especially for employers and organizations, making sure that you mentioned flexibility, Jasleen. And I would definitely say, making sure that you balance that qualitative versus quantitative data. I've been in organizations where they were super strict about assessments, about the numbers, about the data, like hard data, but we're humans. There's going to be variables. COVID showed that for us, and so making sure that knowing that at the end of the day, behind a product, behind a process, there's going to be people. Other people hire people. It's not going to be a perfect process, but making sure that, you're balancing that, and whatever beliefs or values, those can change, but making sure that your processes and how you hire people and how you interview people really change along with your values and your beliefs, and of course your biases as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice from both of you. I really appreciate you sharing that. In the last few minutes, we have a whole bunch of things to share with you. So if you are a person who maybe misses the lives and you want to come back, or video isn't your thing, we are now releasing all of our lives in podcast version on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and Anchor as well. So Anchor is the platform we push them out on. So I will be releasing a post on Disruptors on the LinkedIn for how you can go subscribe to that. So if you want to share it or save it, you can do that. These are always available to view later on our LinkedIn page, but sometimes video just doesn't work. So we understand that. We have a checklist that we are giving away for free right now that you can start to check your bias in your processes. So if you're interested in receiving that checklist that can be beneficial to you, make sure you comment in the feed checklist, and we will reach out to you to get your email so that we can send that out. We will be having a better process for that in a few days, but for right now, just go ahead and comment checklist. And we are offering free DEI evaluations for companies who would like to dig in deeper to understand where their opportunities are and how they can grow. So if you're interested in doing a DEI evaluation with Jasleen and I, please reach out to us on LinkedIn, or you can go to jobdisruptors.com and fill out the form under I'm hiring. If you are a job seeker and you are looking for a community to support you and you are from an underrepresented community, go over to jobdisruptors.com and click on Hire Me, and you can sign up for our community and you'll get a Slack invite. Kim, it was such a pleasure to have you today. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh my gosh. Thank you both. Thank you both so much. I actually just had my first team meeting yesterday, and my latest team member just joined. It was her first day. And so this was all top of mind for me, but like this was a great conversation, and thank you both again for making space and time to invite me and make space for me to join you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you so much for joining us, Kim.
Jasleen, do you have any closing thoughts before we end?
No closing thoughts. Just subscribe for the podcast. We need our subscribers. We need all the support. We're so super grateful for it. And as always, we talked about feedback. Give us feedback. What did you think of this episode? What do you want to see more of? So really help us shape where these conversations go. What are the pain points? What are the gaps? What are the misconceptions that you're struggling with overcoming? And really, help us build the right content for you. Make sure you get that checklist because it's free. And the conversation with Alexandria and myself might not be a free offering that we have forever. So take advantage of that. And we can really look at your business and where you need to get your business as a whole, because it's really like you're getting free executive coaching as well. So yeah, and thank you so much, Kim. It's so great to have another person here who's just as passionate about this work as we are. And yeah, Happy New Year to everyone.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end the live. And Kim, if you want to stick with us for just a moment, thank you everybody for joining us. And we will see you next week when we talk about being a culture ad. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Happy New Year.